Ben, sincerely, this is a question that has dogged our show for as long as we've been doing it. We have tried so hard to have different versions of this conversation, and I'm really excited to just dedicate all of tonight to trying to answer this question. So, to the best of your abilities, for once and for all, what the hell is a Y chromosome? And what can it tell us about human anatomy? If somebody has a Y chromosome, what does that mean? What do we know about them?
Yeah, so the Y chromosome, as many people have probably heard, the Y chromosome is getting smaller and smaller over time, and there's some speculation that in the future the Y chromosome might not even exist anymore. But the things that we know about it, the Y chromosome is very small, and the X chromosome is significantly bigger. You have only very few genes present on the Y chromosome, and kind of the main one that people think of when they're referring to biological sex is the SRY gene. So the SRY gene codes for a specific enzyme called SOX9, which is going to inhibit an enzyme on the female side and cause production of male anatomy, or what we would consider to be male anatomy. So the interesting thing here, though, is there are ways that this SRY gene can move to actually be on the X chromosome. So a lot of people, when we're talking about what makes somebody male or female, and if people want to rely on this Y chromosome, it can get a little dicey because there are cases where the keystone gene, if you will, moves to the X chromosome, and you could have a Y chromosome without the SRY gene and present to be female. And this is a point that, like, before we get like too far into the weeds here, something I want to clarify a bit about biological sex and kind of what we're talking about, so we have consistent definitions. So a lot of people love to fixate on chromosomes, or they like to pick a certain aspect of biology to be the key point of what assigns someone's biological sex, which is not a very good way to think about it because it's multifactorial. There are multiple factors that have to be present in order to cause certain anatomical features, such as, we break this down into different categories. So the chromosomes are your genetic sex or your genotype. That is one aspect of your biological sex. There's also phenotypic sex, which is the appearance, and that can be broken down into anatomy, and that can be either your external anatomy or your internal anatomy, because both can be different. They might not be the same. And then you can also have hormonal sex, which is if you have primarily estrogen or primarily testosterone. And it's the interaction of all three of these components that will determine how your body acts with regards to reproduction or sexual activity. And so we don't really need to look at a key point. And I debate this with people constantly. They say, oh, well, the SRY gene is really the key thing. If you have an SRY gene, you are male. Or if you don't have an SRY gene, you are female. Not taking into account that even if you have that gene or you don't, your other factors, such as your hormones, can change your appearance to make it seem like you had an SRY or make it seem like you didn't. So it can get very, very messy. And that's kind of why I wanted to be on here talking about this.
Yeah, no, and I'm so glad that you are. It goes without saying that sort of like 8th grade natural sciences understanding of genetics that's based on a bunch of like Punnett squares and sort of half listening to a teacher lecture from the front of the classroom, that XXXY dichotomy is a little bit oversimple, and I'm hoping that you can help us to understand why. I guess what I am getting from you so far is that what we know is that that XY, the Y chromosome, often or typically carries this SRY gene, which is typically expressed in what we consider male anatomy. We're talking about the SRY gene turning into penises some of the time. I'm oversimplifying. Help me see the flaws here.
Yeah. So where we used to think of sex as being binary, we are now looking at it as being bimodal. And because we have these variations of not even just with the the SRY gene, but you can have variations of people with multiple sets of sex chromosomes or fewer. So you can have somebody who is XXY, and that's typically referred to as Klinefelter syndrome. You can have somebody who is XXXY or XXXX. You can have multiple copies of X. You can have people who are XYY. You can have people who are just one X and missing another chromosome. It's very difficult to have someone who is just Y because you have genes on the X chromosome that are necessary for being alive. So normally someone who is just Y is not going to survive. So we don't typically talk about those. But it's more of a spectrum than we've thought about it in the past. And so, yes, it is more common to see everyone's, if you, again, going back to the categories of your genes and then your anatomy and your hormones, it's most common that those are all three going to line up to be either male or female. But that's not always the case. Since we have these variations, you cannot look at it as purely binary. So what we say is we're not saying that there isn't a majority case, but we're saying that not everyone fits that majority. So we need to be flexible in how we think about it and not exclude people for not fitting the norm. Because something that is atypical doesn't mean that it's not relevant and doesn't mean it doesn't exist. These are real people with real variations. And now the trick is moving from it being considered as a pathology to being considered as a variation of normal.
Yeah, so that I think has been the model for so long. We're gonna talk a little bit later about terms like intersex and sort of their modern appropriateness and some of those kinds of ideas. But I think generally speaking, the notion has been there are regular men, regular women, and then like a handful of misfits that don't really fit our model, but it's always the exception that proves the rule. That doesn't sound like the bimodal distribution that you're describing. What are the like limitations of that kind of model?
Well, I mean, thinking medically, a lot of times with people who have a difference in sexual development that would cause them to have these variations, a lot of them don't know that they have these, or you wouldn't even be able to tell. And most of the time, you would know. There is some clear anatomical variation that you can see that would classify someone as having a variation. But there are specific case reports that I've even covered on my channel where you have, I think, both of these were like around like preteens to early teens ages of boys who they had identified as male. Their anatomy was typically male. Their hormones were male. They just seemed like normal, if you will, boys, presenting for something not even related. One of them had an accident on his bike where he straddled the bike seat and got a rupture of one of his testes. So he wasn't even going in. Yeah, I know that's a painful thing to think about. But that he didn't even go in with any issues related to reproduction or with abnormal anatomy. He had a trauma to the area. They ultrasound it, and they find out that he has a mass in one of his testes. And so they look at it, and they found that it was half ovary, half testis. So this person who appeared to be a typical male, you never would have guessed that he had a difference in sexual development, had ovotestes, and so with something like that, they karyotyped him found out that actually the majority of his DNA was XX. And he had a mosaic Klinefelter. So only the DNA in his reproductive tract was XXY. And so that's where he got the SRY gene to have that anatomy. But the rest of his body was XX. And he had both sets of gonads. So
I didn't even know that was possible, that you could have like two different sets of genetic information within the same, within the same person.
yeah, it's totally possible. And it relates to a lot of either chromosome non-disjunction, where chromosomes don't properly separate during mitosis and meiosis. It can also happen with if someone's a chimera, where if you have a twin in utero, and this is something that I know has been on those law shows, like law and crime shows, where they can't find the perpetrator because they have two sets of DNA. But that's a real thing. You have people who have a twin in the uterus that they sort of absorb, and they have multiple sets of DNA. And if you have that only in certain parts of your body, then you'd have only that genetic representation in that part. So if you swap out your reproductive tract with XXY or XY when you would normally be XX, you're going to see the effects of that.
Well, I think the temptation here is to maybe see this as a bunch of like very progressive, like whataboutism. Like, okay, well, there are these kind of rare exceptions, and you see these like really fascinating TED Talks where you'll have somebody who very clearly presents as what we all would understand as like a conventionally attractive woman, explaining that she has like a Y chromosome, and that's just the way that it presented, and everybody freaks out. And then you start to think, okay, but how common is this really? I know that you mentioned at the top, kind of three different categories of differentiation that are all blending together to create our presentation, for lack of a better term, or a more scientific one, I guess, or more precise. But when we're talking about the genetics, how often do those get thrown off, or how many variations, or how often do we see variations in genetics like the ones that you're describing?
So we see this quite frequently, actually, and especially with the genetic stuff, it's a bit more rare. The more common ones that you will see are Klinefelter, which is XXY, or Turner syndrome, which is X, just one X. Those are the most common, and I know people with Turner syndrome, it's more difficult to tell that they have it. They'll present like being shorter in height. They sometimes might have some heart issues. But apart from that, you might not be able to tell someone had those chromosomes. Similarly, with XXY, you might have a more feminine presenting male. So you'd have somebody with male genitalia, but they have wider hips, or they might grow breasts. So those are the most common in terms of chromosomes. But then looking at hormones, and hormones can do a number for your presentation, and those are extremely commonly variable, especially in things like polycystic ovarian syndrome. Is a case where females produce high amounts of androgens and testosterone. And so if somebody with PCOS, especially a severe case of PCOS, were to get pregnant and they had a high level of testosterone exposure to the fetus before their birth, you can have effects of testosterone on that baby. So testosterone does a few things for the development of male anatomy, and it actually signals for the maintenance of the mesonephric duct, which will become most of the internal reproductive tract for a male presentation. And then, so it is going to stimulate that, and it's also testosterone inhibits. It can help inhibit the paramesonephric duct, which stimulates the female tract. And then testosterone also, if it is converted to DHT, which is a stronger form of testosterone, that can lead to external male presentation as well. So you get high levels of testosterone on a fetus that's developing, you can create male anatomy. So even something that's maternal, that parent had the hormone imbalance in their own body, that can affect the fetus, even if the fetus had XX genes. So that is one example. Another kind of example with hormones, trying to think of, because PCOS is a really good one. Things like androgen insensitivity, where they don't respond to testosterone, that can change their presentation. That's a genetic thing as well, but where they can produce testosterone, but their receptors don't work. So even if you had an appropriate amount of testosterone, it can't signal anything. So if you can't stimulate the mesonephric duct to become the male reproductive tract, it is going to then switch over to the female pathway, and it's going to create female anatomy. And you can get incongruence with those. So that's a couple examples. There's plenty of examples where we see how hormones affect these, and there are more than I can count of differences in sexual development that can result. And that's why I made videos on it, because you really, like, people want to take this as such a black and white issue about what sex is, and not even going into gender, because adding gender and societal norms on top of it is a whole other complication. But just even talking about biology, like, the people who don't know the ins and outs of this, of course they can assign what they think is typical or not, but you really get into the nitty gritty and you realize that you really can't assign much just by looking at somebody.
Yeah, well, so I want to make sure that I'm following along, and then just kind of summarize a lot of what you're saying, because it is very different from this like two-box system of you're either one or the other. There are all of these different factors, and I don't even want to say that sometimes things can go wrong. But there are oftentimes that you will have a gene that's not actually showing up, or you will have a hormone that isn't actually doing its job because it's not being received in different ways. And in all of these cases, whether we're talking about like typical development or atypical development, there are just so many switches that, you know, nobody is having 100 out of 100 switches flipped or 0 out of 100. Everybody's got some sort of blend. And you mentioned that idea of a bimodal distribution. And I don't have one to show people. There is one in the show notes to this episode, but I'd really encourage people to just Google that word, because I feel like if you're not familiar with statistical distribution, that picture might be the most accurate way of describing what we're talking about here. Do I have it all right so far?
Yes, you do.
Yeah. So if we are all sort of these like blends, this, you know, sort of yin yang of like, maybe I'm 99% quote unquote male and 1% female, or if I am, you know, 15% female and 95, you know, those kinds of ratios, is that at all an accurate way of understanding this, or is there something more to it?
I mean, that's one way to think about it. In terms of practical application, I get into these discussions quite frequently with people, especially trying to use these arguments to oppose trans people, which is a whole different conversation that, like, they don't even need to bring sex into that conversation. But you get people that want to say, why can't, and from a medical perspective myself, because I'm going into a field where I will be treating people, and it, of course, it's important to know the anatomy and physiology of the people that you're treating. But people say, well, why can't we just assign people to this box? Like, if you are going to treat a person that looks like a man, aren't you going to medically treat them different than someone who looks like a woman? And that points out a really important concept in the healthcare system, even, of people are individuals, You can't just slap a treatment on everybody. And I'm sure everyone has experienced this with their own healthcare providers at some point, where there was a treatment that was recommended or that was works for a lot of people, and maybe it didn't work as well for you, or maybe you had to go through an alternative like step, like if you had to get extra imaging or extra something because something wasn't working for you the same way that it works for everybody else. And that's just because we're individual people and we don't all fit this one box. And so maybe instead of saying, well, I need to make an assumption about you in order to treat you, maybe you treat them as an individual and you take it step by step, and you can evaluate, okay, is their anatomy this? Do they have these organs? Like, you shouldn't be going to, like, say, a gynecologist. Let's say you have a cisgender woman who had a hysterectomy. That person's a woman, but they don't need the same evaluation as somebody who has a uterus, right? So if they don't have a uterus, we can rule some things out. Like, they're probably not pregnant and they probably don't have uterine cancer. But so I can't even just say this person's a woman. I need to evaluate them for uterine cancer. No, I know that they don't because they don't have a uterus. So putting someone in a box is lazy, and it goes against the critical thinking that we should be having when we should be able to read their history and say, okay, you have this anatomy. This applies to you, or your hormones are in this range. So I can use this kind of treatment with you. So maybe instead of relying on the box to further hateful arguments, we should work on how to be productive without relying on a crutch like a box.
Yeah, well said. I want to give Nate a chance to jump onto the phones here in just a second, but before he does, something I'm fond of saying on the show, and that I often get a lot of pushback on, is that, you know, if there are 7.5 billion people on this planet, it's realistic to say that there are 7.5 billion genders on this planet, because we, you know, as much as we might try to like group and clump people together, that we really are entirely unique in that way. That's talking about gender, but everything that you're describing about hormones and genetics and just the interplay of the way we present sexually, is it fair to say that everybody has not just unique genetics, but a unique sexuality as well?
I'm sure, yeah. And of course, we end up at some point having to use some categories and having to use some assumptions, because otherwise it would be very hard to really study medicine or come up with treatment plans, because you can't 100% be individualistic. But at least you can have a starting point with people, and you can use a category to group things to some extent. It's not meant to be an end-all be-all. It's meant to more easily organize your thoughts and organize things that you're going to do. But we learn, even if you take a lower level science class, a lot of the things that they tell you are not entirely accurate, because you're not at a point where you can really understand the nuance yet. You need to understand something before you can move on and uncover the more nitty gritty, or the things that don't really follow the rules. So it's not meant to be an end point. That's not the place that we're getting to. That's the place where we're starting. And then as you learn more, you can branch out and say, okay, maybe we can switch to thinking about it in this way. Or one of my favorite examples for this is like, if you took a chemistry class and someone says that this molecule is hydrophobic, and your teacher may have described it as, this doesn't like water, or it's scared of water. We all know that molecules aren't scared of anything. That's not real.
Sure.
But it's a tool to help your brain kind of wrap your mind around what's happening. And then once you learn that, you can abandon that kind of heuristic and say, okay, that wasn't really accurate, but it helped me understand that now, okay, we can violate the rule, so to speak.
Yeah. So at best, these labels are somewhat descriptive. They give us sort of a
Yes.
sense of a thing, but they're not prescriptive, as in you must have this, this, and this in order to qualify.
Absolutely. And you put that very beautifully.
Yeah, glad to hear it.